Welcome to the debate. Today we're addressing one of the deepest and most challenging questions in the study of the mind, the functional role of our conscious experience in human action. I mean, does that subjective feeling of conscious will actually cause our behavior, guiding it from the top down, or is that feeling just an elaborate explanation, a kind of narration generated after the fact?
And this topic really sits at the intersection of our scientific understanding and our most, deeply held human intuitions. If consciousness isn't the driver, then we have to fundamentally reassess what purpose it serves and what it even means to be an intentional agent.
Absolutely. So the central question we're framing is this. Does consciousness primarily function as a causal control system, directing behavior and setting intentions? Or does it serve a retrospective role as a high-level monitoring and narrative mechanism? The brain's self-appointed historian, so to speak.
I'll be defending the view that conscious thought possesses a genuine, necessary, and non-epiphenomenal causal role, especially when we look beyond simple automatic movements toward complex, goal-directed human actions.
And I'm going to present the skeptical argument that consciousness functions fundamentally as a retrospective narrator. It's a brilliant system for weaving a coherent story about our decisions, but those decisions are, in fact, already being executed by rapid, highly efficient, unconscious neural processes. My core perspective is that the subjective experience of willing is, frequently an illusion of causation. We feel like we initiated an action, but the empirical timeline suggests something else entirely. The strongest evidence for this skepticism comes from classic neuroscientific findings, particularly those that measure brain activity leading up to simple, spontaneous movements.
You're referring to studies involving the readiness potential, of course.
Exactly. We can observe the neural preparation for a movement, that slow-building electrical signal, the readiness potential, starting hundreds of milliseconds before the subject reports any conscious intention or urge to act. And the movement itself happens after that conscious intention. So this temporal mismatch, it strongly suggests that unconscious brain processes are initiating the chain of events. The conscious I will now move moment, it just arrives too late to be the true cause. It appears to be more of a perception of an action that's already underway.
I understand the compelling nature of that temporal gap. I do. But I would frame the psychological evidence a bit differently.
Well, let me just elaborate on the psychological case for consciousness as a narrative device first. Look at this phenomenon known as choice blindness. Researchers will present participants with two choices, say two photographs of faces, and ask which one they find more attractive. After the subject chooses, the photo they rejected is subtly substituted for the one they chose, and crucially, most subjects not only fail to notice the swap, but when they're asked to explain why they chose that picture, which was in fact the one they rejected, they confidently invent detailed reasons to justify an outcome they never actually selected. This shows the left hemisphere's relentless drive to act as an interpreter, It's committed to fabricating a coherent, causal narrative, no matter the underlying reality.
I readily agree that the brain is a remarkable sense-making machine and that, yes, post-hoc rationalization is a fundamental part of human cognition. However, I think we leap too quickly from the finding that the brain fabricates explanations to the conclusion that consciousness has zero causal influence on action initiation or planning. I come at this problem from the functional requirements of consciousness. If conscious thought were truly epiphenomenal, just a shadow with no impact, it would be very difficult to explain the incredible neural real estate it occupies, given how critical it is for sophisticated adaptive human behavior.
But complex, skilled actions like playing a musical instrument or driving a car, they rapidly become automatic and unconscious. That proves that high complexity doesn't necessarily require conscious intervention.
That's true for automatic skills. But let's really challenge the generalization of that Liebit-style evidence you're relying on. The critical finding, that readiness potential preceding conscious awareness, it's drawn almost exclusively from tasks where subjects make arbitrary decisions, randomly choosing a moment to flex a wrist. These decisions lack any real consequence or value. But when researchers switch the paradigm to truly deliberate choices, decisions that involve value or moral weight or planning, like deciding which charity to donate to. That predictive neural precursor, the readiness potential, it's strongly diminished or it's even absent entirely. This casts serious doubt on the idea that the unconscious initiation claim applies to the choices that genuinely matter in our lives.
That is a legitimate differentiation in the empirical data, I'll grant you that.
And furthermore, consciousness provides specific computational advantages that are necessary for survival and for culture. It is essential for logical, systematic reasoning, for mental practice and simulation, and crucially, for allowing our behavior to be shaped by non-present factors, anticipating long-term consequences, sticking to goals we set months ago, or reflecting on abstract policies. Conscious thought sequences organized through language and narrative allow the brain to integrate information across all these specialized submodules. It's the very foundation of human culture and long-term self-regulation. That function has to be profoundly causal, even if the influence is indirect and delayed.
That function has to be profoundly causal, even if the influence is indirect and delayed. Okay, so this is where the core tension lies, isn't it? Is consciousness the CEO or is it the PR department just responsible for the press release? Let's focus on that distinction you raised between arbitrary and deliberate actions. I acknowledge the empirical difference in the ARPI behavior, but I believe the skeptical interpretation still holds the most weight.
Okay, tell me more. Why do you maintain the skeptical interpretation for deliberate actions then?
Well, my concern is that we might be confusing noise with a genuine unconscious decision. We could argue that the readiness potential in those arbitrary choices, it doesn't represent an unconscious decision at all. Instead, it might simply be the artifactual accumulation of stochastic, autocorrelated neural noise that when it reaches a certain threshold, triggers the movement. It's a mechanism for breaking symmetry, for determining when to move, not what to do. And if we accept that noise model, then the RP isn't an initiation signal. It's just the brain's internal randomness determining the timing of a movement that bypasses the complex value assessment system entirely.
That is certainly a powerful alternative interpretation for the RP, reframing it as a technical artifact of timing rather than a marker of a decision.
And even if we grant that value-based deliberation uses systems closer to conscious awareness, the ultimate conclusion is still quite restrictive. The most generous causal role we can give consciousness, based on other timing studies, is the power to veto or inhibit a movement that automatic processes have already put into motion. But even this veto capacity, the conscious I won't, can be seen as just a late-stage filter, which itself might be predetermined by prior brain states. The fundamental initiation still seems to happen beneath the threshold of conscious awareness.
But that puts the burden of proof squarely back on the skeptic. If the readiness potential were a universally generalizable index of unconscious decision-making, it should appear in deliberate, value-based choices. Its absence, or its strong attenuation, implies that the neural mechanisms driving high-stakes decisions involving the prefrontal cortex and our value systems are qualitatively different from the low-level circuits that handle simple wrist movements. These complex decisions, I'd argue, they require conscious reasoning, because that's the only mechanism we have for comparing abstract, non-present factors.
And yet, what if consciousness is simply necessary to experience the comparison of values, not to actually enforce the choice?
That assumes a purely passive role. But let's consider functionality. The ability of the conscious mind to form coherent, explanatory narratives, that interpreter we discussed, is precisely what facilitates sophisticated planning and learning from past events. And why is this critical? Because conscious reasoning enables the communication of complex cultural information and group plans through language. This mechanism, it allows for what you could call downward causation in the brain.
Downward causation. That's a pretty significant claim. How exactly are you defining that mechanism in a physically integrated system?
I'm defining it as a policy-setting function. When we consciously deliberate and decide on a long-term goal, for instance, I will start saving money next month, or I'm going to implement a new study routine. That macro-level mental state, articulated through conscious thought, changes the functional landscape of the underlying neural networks. It sets a persistent bias, a policy, that affects the probability of future low-level neural activity. It might take time, but that consciously formed policy fundamentally structures future automatic actions.
Therefore, conscious deliberation is a necessary condition for that long-term behavior, making it causally relevant even if it's in a time-delayed and indirect way.
I'll concede that setting a long-term policy is a critical function, but if conscious thought is merely a passive byproduct of those underlying physical substrates, as strong epiphenomenalism suggests, then its impact is observational, not originating. Your description of its functional necessity, it sounds more like a sophisticated monitoring system that confirms the outcome of the policy, not the entity that actually writes that policy into the system in the first place.
But the line between high-level monitoring and control is far more blurred than your analogy suggests. Let's shift back to retrospective construction. We've established that the brain creates these narratives. Consider neurological examples like split brain patients, where the left hemisphere literally invents reasons it confabulates from movements initiated by the isolated right hemisphere. It's genuinely unnerving to realize that our own brain can fabricate our reality so effortlessly.
It is deeply unsettling, but that is precisely the point. The left hemisphere's relentless need to construct an agentic explanation strongly implies that the feeling of agency is a retrospective psychological convenience. The feeling of, I willed that action, it's constructed after the action occurs, not as the cause, but as the sense-maker.
Yet, if this sense-making capacity is essential for forming stable self-concepts, and for sharing those concepts through language, which is undeniably functional and adaptive, then we have to grant it some degree of causal weight. If consciousness evolved because it allows us to plan and communicate, then those functions are causal in the context of human behavior.
Okay, let's introduce the sociological and psychological data here. We see pretty compelling evidence for the pragmatic argument for agency. Studies show that when subjects affirm a belief in autonomy and free will, they exhibit concrete, better outcomes: reduced aggression, increased helpfulness, greater perseverance on difficult tasks. This belief system is intertwined with core cognitive processes that enhance human functioning.
Exactly. This isn't just theory. This is demonstrable, measurable proof that the belief in agency is linked to better self-regulation and pro-social behavior. This suggests consciousness plays a necessary, meaningful, motivational role that translates into physical action. Why would the brain dedicate resources to fostering a belief system if it had zero practical consequences?
I classify that entire set of findings under the illusion but useful hypothesis. I acknowledge entirely that the belief in conscious control is vital for justifying moral responsibility, ethical systems, and the structure of societal punishment. This is perhaps why this pervasive illusion evolved, to facilitate high-level social cooperation and allow us to hold one another accountable.
But the argument is that this isn't just a cultural justification. It's a measurable psychological variable that affects our behavior now, in real time, influencing the choices we make. It seems to function exactly like a cause.
The usefulness of the belief does not prove the causal efficacy of the conscious mechanism itself. If the core physical mechanisms of the brain are deterministic or probabilistic, and consciousness is a passive phenomenon, the cultural edifice built around the idea of conscious command can still drive that prosocial behavior. The adaptive quality lies in the social structure that uses the narrative, not necessarily in consciousness originating the underlying neural processes. The narrator is useful. The narrator is not necessarily the author. But if the capacity for narration and reflection is what allows us to formulate and commit to complex, time-delayed goals, goals that fundamentally change the trajectory of our subsequent automated actions, then that narrative system is exerting a form of delayed yet powerful control. It may not trigger the individual muscle flex, but it certainly triggers the long-term career change. So, where we stand is this. While conscious thought is profoundly important for synthesizing information, for communication, and social planning, the empirical evidence, specifically the timing of action initiation and the existence of retrospective cognitive construction, strongly suggests that consciousness acts primarily as a high-level monitoring system and narrator. It coordinates information and explains actions to the self and to others, but the spontaneous moment-to-moment actions are fundamentally initiated by rapid, efficient, unconscious processes.
My position remains that conscious thought provides a sophisticated evolutionary advantage by enabling functions that automatic systems simply cannot handle: systematic,
abstract deliberation, long-term goal formulation, and the ability to revise one's own values and policies over time via downward causation. The absence of immediate neuroprecursors in complex, deliberate actions confirms that for the choices that truly matter, those involving value and planning, consciousness moves beyond mere narration to exert a meaningful, if complex and time-delayed control over behavior.
The tension between the brain's automated efficiency and our subjective feeling of command is one of the most compelling challenges in understanding what we call neuroreality.
It forces us to confront the limitations of our own intuitions about agency.
So if we accept that unconscious processes initiate our physical actions, but conscious reasoning is undeniably necessary to formulate and commit to complex, long-term goals and social policies, where exactly does genuine moral responsibility truly reside?